ever-popular Africa Report, Ethiopia's challenge to regain a seaport. It's my pleasure now to welcome co-host Shabaka Kambon, Reverend Kwame Kamau, and Dr. Fergus. Gentlemen, a very good evening.
And a very pleasant good
Good
evening to you
evening,
as
and
well.
good evening to the listeners on Facebook 91.1 and on YouTube. Good evening. Yes.
Absolutely. Well, we are in for quite a treat this evening, as you would have heard by way of our very good man there, Ruskin, by way of Talk City 91.1 FM. Again, I would like to welcome our YouTube audience as well as our Facebook audience again to another edition of Indaba, the voice of the Emancipation Support Committee, the voice of the people, and a place to find consensus. Certainly the place where knowledge grows. On tonight, we have a power-packed panel by way of two exceptionally gifted scholars within the Pan-African space, not only dealing with history, but also dealing with the whole issue of reparations and change within our community. With that said, we start tonight's presentation with another scintillating edition of the Africa Report. And so we want to turn alive to the introduction of our beloved historian, Baba Dr. Fergus, so he can take us into this very important discourse. Ethiopia landlocked. It has been so for a number of decades. They need to have a seaport. How will they engage that? They would need, of course, to treat with it by way of a neighbor. Looking forward to tonight's discourse. But over to you, Baba.
Yes, as usual, there's always a little bit of history, a little bit of contemporary affairs, current affairs, some politics here and there. In this case, a lot of international politics involved. And to some extent, it really also addresses the issue of decolonization, and therefore is a good link, not as deeply connected as last week and previous weeks, but indeed it does speak to decolonization, at least not from the Ethiopian perspective, but from the perspectives of the Somalians and others in the region. So, Rene, bring up the video and let us roll into that report.
The report focuses on current tensions in the Horn of Africa over Somaliland's agreement to lease Ethiopia the port of Berbera, located in the Gulf of Aden. Ethiopia is the most populous landlocked country in the world. In order to put the conflict in its proper context, we take a quick journey into Ethiopian history, from the time when it was counted among the three most powerful empires in the Eastern Hemisphere, during which time it had unhindered access to the sea, mainly along the Eritrean coast, which one historian describes as Ethiopia's traditional window to the outside world. This waterway has been one of the most strategic trade routes since ancient times, but more so since the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. The waterway currently accounts for the vast majority of shipping between Europe and Asia, and 12% of global trade. For this reason, the first places that Europeans sought to colonize in the era of the scramble for Africa were territories on both sides of the Red Sea coast and the Gulf of Aden. Ethiopia is seeking access to the sea again, but through Somaliland. The Africa Report previously introduced Somaliland to Indaba listeners as the safest country in Africa, perhaps in the world. The occasion was Woody Meyer's visit. Meyer was shocked to see sidewalk jewelers and money traders leaving their wares exposed without any form of security in order to participate in midday prayers, without any fear of being robbed.
You can see money everywhere.
This is money, eh?
This is our currency exchange. He just went to pray, covered it up, and came back. That's how safe it is here.
Somaliland is a self-governing territory, but not a recognized state, not by the UN, not even by the African Union. Somaliland gained independence in 1960, but within days it entered into a political union with Somalia. In 1991, Somaliland seceded and established its own government. Somalia, however, still considers it a breakaway territory, not an independent state. Ethiopia was the dominant power in the Horn of Africa for several centuries, before and after the rise of Islam in the 7th century. At that time, Ethiopia was known as Aksum. From the reign of King Izana in the 4th century CE, the first Christian king of Aksum, to a later successor, Emperor Caleb of the 6th century, Aksum extended its frontiers across the Red Sea, annexing most of the southern Arabian Peninsula. At that time, Aksum traded as far as India and China, which is evidenced by Ethiopian coins found in those countries. During the 8th century, Arab Muslims controlled Massawa, the main port in Eritrea. For a brief while in the 16th century, Ethiopia regained control of the port, but not for long, losing it to the Ottoman Turks. The port remained under the control of Egypt, the proxy power of the Ottoman Turks during the early 19th century, with the support and connivance of the British, who preferred Muslim control rather than the Christian state of Ethiopia. The situation worsened under European imperialism. As early as 1862, the French had occupied Obok, which they call French Somaliland, and is now known as Djibouti. In the 1880s, just before the scramble officially began, Italy seized the ports of Assab and Massawa in Eritrea. The British colonized the western region of Somalia, calling it British Somaliland. Later in the decade, Italy also seized the rest of the Somali peninsula, calling it Italian Somaliland. For those who are only listening to this report, all these areas are in the Somali Peninsula, what we commonly call the Horn of Africa, opposite Arabia and Yemen. The successful scramble by the three European powers ensured that Ethiopia remained landlocked and vulnerable to European invasion. European exclusion of Ethiopia from the coast lasted until 1952. Having lost World War II, Italy ceded Eritrea to Britain. In 1952, Eritrea was federated with Ethiopia, giving Ethiopia direct access to the sea. A few years later, Emperor Haile Selassie reduced Eritrea to a mere province of Ethiopia, plunging the country into a long civil war. When Eritrea regained her independence in 1993, Ethiopia once again lost access to the sea. On the 1st of January 2024, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Abiy Ahmed, and the President of Somaliland, Musa Abdi, signed a Memorandum of Understanding in which Somaliland agreed to lease 20 square kilometers of coastline to Ethiopia, including the port of Berbera, to build a naval base, in exchange for Ethiopia's recognition of Somaliland as a sovereign state, which would make Ethiopia the first country in the world to do so. Many factors are at play which cannot be addressed in this brief report. Suffice it to say, among the most important questions are those of international law, ethnic nationalism, Ethiopia's military expansion, relations within the eastern region of the African Union, to which both Ethiopia and Somalia belong, and Addis Ababa as headquarters of the African Union. Reaction to the MOU was swift and combative. The very next day, the Somali cabinet declared that the agreement was a clear violation against its sovereignty and unity, and the government recalled their ambassador from Addis Ababa. Ethiopia does not yet have a navy, but is actively creating one. In June last year, Ethiopia graduated its first batch of naval officers, but an announcement was made only in November, when Abiy declared that Ethiopia was seeking a sea outlet for its navy. Somalia is a member of the Arab League. So too is Egypt, which a few years ago threatened war over the construction and filling of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. The Arab League opposed the MOU with threats that border on jihad. After a meeting in Cairo between the presidents of Somalia and Egypt, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi declared, "We will not allow anyone to threaten Somalia or come near Somalia."
Somalia is an Arab state, a member of the Arab League who has rights according to the League of Arab States Charter in the joint defense against any threat to it. We are not saying this to threaten anyone, but for people to understand that we will not allow anyone to threaten Somalia or come near Somalia.
Somalia reported Ethiopia to the United Nations Security Council, which referred the case back to the AU, which is yet to meet formally on the conflict. In concluding this week's report, we should note that the United States of America has military bases in Djibouti and Somalia since 2013. In 2020, Russia signed an agreement to establish a naval base in Port Sudan, that's on the Red Sea coast. China completed the building of a naval base in Djibouti in 2021. There must therefore be more than meets the eye in preventing a fellow African country access to the same maritime space.
So that's your Africa report for this week. As you can see, a whole lot of issues there in a part of Africa that is of extreme significance to the international community, particularly to events in the Middle East, in the Indian Ocean. It's a very strategic region, but for Africa, it is also of extreme significance. And we are yet to see how this will play out. The African Union has addressed the situation, but not set about to resolve the conflict, but they have spoken about it. They have condemned the attempt by Ethiopia to expand its naval capabilities in the Gulf of Aden, but they have not met as a union to address the issue, how to resolve the issue. It's a very tickling thing. And as I said, it has some issues with respect to decolonization, which of course would inform some of the questions I would ask my panelists this evening. Here are some states, some peoples in minority, because we seem to forget sometimes that there are minorities in the colonial situations, not always majorities. How do you decolonize as reparations if you are a minority? Particularly in a situation that we find the Somali people in Somaliland. So those are some issues. I would redirect them to our Caribbean situation as we engage in the topic of decolonization and reparations this evening. Over to you, my brother.
Thank you so very much. And again, another scintillating edition of the Africa report. So many dimensions to that. But by way of our segue into the discussion of the decolonization of the Caribbean, we find that within our shores, there are many intrigues as well that speaks to the issue of having to sometimes balance between our national interests and that of our collective CARICOM interests. But here tonight to help us unpack these very powerful details, we have Dr. Niambi Hall Campbell, Dean and Chair of the Bahamas National Reparations Committee. Of course, we also have with us on tonight no less a person than the PFAD of the United Nations, that is the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent Ambassador, no less a person than, of course, the Honorable Ambassador Dr. June Soomer as well, Chair and Designate of the PFAD, what we'd refer to as lead body within the UN that deals with the business of African affairs. Welcome to Indaba on tonight, most illustrious Pan-Africanists. We are so enthralled. We are so certainly impressed by your presence on tonight. There's much to discuss because, as we know, the Caribbean is ablaze with all kinds of intrigues. On the one hand, there's fire to the north, literal humanitarian crises, plural, happening in Haiti, no fault of their own exclusively. There's been much meddling over decades, even centuries. We've dealt with that in our previous programs. We have over 20 states in the Caribbean region that still have not been given acquired independent status, let alone Republican status. We are a CARICOM region. We are a CARICOM body. but at the same time, there are issues and challenges in relation to how do we harmonize, how do we come together and shake off once and for all the vestiges of those what we would call European white supremacist footprints. We want to start on tonight by way of simply just greeting the beauty of you and again welcoming you to Indaba. Dr. Soomer, we'll start with you on tonight. You wear an extremely weighty hat. The saying goes, heavy is the head that wears the crown. Coming into tonight's program, we were learning about your very hectic itinerary, and no doubt because of your scholarship and what you've done within St. Lucia, within the ACS, within the OECS, within the United Nations. You're a stalwart, you're a champion of African people, and here you are now serving at the level of PFAD. Question to you on tonight as we bid you welcome to Indaba. What do you believe, even as you say hello and greetings and good night, what do you believe that PFAD can bring to the table as it relates to the discussion of Caribbean and CARICOM decolonization that our previous efforts and institutions could not have achieved?
Thank you very much for your warm welcome. I have to tell you that I cannot sing at all. So the song that you want me to sing, I might not be able to make that joyful noise. But I do have a few points to make with regard to your question, especially as it relates to the permanent forum. And then as the program progresses, I'll speak a little more about my own views on decolonization and reparations. I think that the permanent forum coming out of the decade for people of African descent is one of the successes of that decade. That we were able to say that we must concentrate some effort on looking at the humanity of people of African descent, looking at the rights of people of African descent, looking at the way forward and the sustainable development for people of African descent. I believe that the permanent forum is doing something that no other body has done, and that is speaking to the people on the ground. So we are speaking to not just governments. Governments have appointed us, but they have given us the leeway to speak to citizens, global citizens, every person of African descent in the diaspora, to get their views and their ideas on how we can then make a better living and livelihoods for people of African descent. And so we have been engaging and we have engaged. We are going to have our third session very soon in Geneva, but we have had two previous sessions that have concentrated on a number of issues related to people of African descent. A lot of them are contained within the reparations dialogue, whether it is issues related to systemic racism, to structural racism, to development justice, to reparatory justice itself, to health issues related not just to one group. We try to be a little more specific, but how it relates to women of African descent who have special discriminations against them. We have also looked at issues related to the continued challenges facing people of African descent when it comes to migration. We tackle issues at the fundamental level like statistics, because the lack of statistics is making us invisible. How can we address these issues? And even more importantly, as we look at the nature of the statistics, the emergence of AI and how AI is affecting and going to affect us in the future is one of the things that we look at. So we look at a variety of subjects, and a lot of the recommendations, we had more than 300 recommendations over the last two sessions. And just about every single recommendation came from civil society groups, people with whom we engage, and we are trying to give them a voice that they have not had before. So I think that is where we can make the difference.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that very powerful response there. And certainly we wish you all the very best with regards to that exercise. We'll definitely talk about the decolonization of the Caribbean in a much broader context as we develop tonight's program. We want to bring in Dr. Niambi Campbell Hall at this point in time. Part of your work deals with psychology, and psychology, of course, speaks to our mental health. Certainly within the Caribbean, we've experienced all kinds of, and certainly within the African diaspora, all kinds of challenges as it relates to mental health and mental health issues. With regards to the decolonization agenda within the Caribbean region, do you see that a fully decolonized Caribbean and African diaspora are playing a positive role in helping us to achieve the kind of mental health, the kind of well-being that we need to experience as a community? And what steps do you think we need to engage? Again, not only at the level of government, but certainly by way of the former ambassador speaking there, by way of civil society. What can we do to take that ball forward, to take that agenda forward? Yes, there's amplification. Yes, there's speaking to UN bodies. Yes, there's engagement at that level. Often the critique is, if I may say so, that these bodies are fully aware of what has happened to us. As a matter of fact, they, in many instances, were part of the problem in terms of bringing about such levels of trauma and destruction in the first place. And so their lack of response is not an instance of ignorance on their part, or even a lack of statistics, but simply because white is right, and in some cases might, and they don't care. So in that context of people not caring, what can we do? How do we move that ball forward? How do we ensure our psychological well-being? How do we heal the many wounds within the Caribbean region? And how does your work factor into that discourse? A very pleasant good night and welcome.
Good night. Welcome. Thank you. So that's you started me off with a heavy swing. So I'm gonna see if I can strike. I think that one of the things that we have to always keep in mind when we talk about decolonization is that the process of colonization was one that was that manifested in many different ways, but that the process of colonization was complete, right? A lot of times we think of it in terms of the land that was taken over, but the purpose of many of these colonizers was to create many versions of themselves, right? They didn't want Bahamians to be Bahamians who felt like they were ruled by Britain. They wanted Bahamians to think that they were British, right? As British as they could get, because you could only, we're up here British and you're semi, under us British. But just the idea that the process was that your thinking, your way of understanding the world, your way of perceiving yourself should be done through the lens of a British person. And that colonization process required you to forget, to deny, and to repress anything that was not in keeping with that British model. So there's a lot of unearthing that we have to do to kind of first know that we're not British, and then to figure out, okay, well, since we are not that, who indeed are we? And so that is one of the first steps that we have to engage in when we talk about decolonization and the mental health of us in our region. And those are steps that we have to take on our own, right? A politician is not going to do that. The civil society groups are not going to do that. There are ways that they can actually help, but we first have to understand that this is the problem that we're dealing with. Fanon in Wretched of the Earth talks about this a lot, and I think he's one of the people in our region that we don't talk about enough. I could speak, especially in the Bahamas, in terms of his work as a Pan-Africanist, but also he was a psychiatrist, right? And one of the things that Fanon brings up is, do we want to be free, or do we want to take the colonizer's place? And so we have to figure out, do we want to be free? And when we start to, I think, answer those questions, then we can go to the politicians and say, well, do you want us to be free, or do you want to take the colonizer's place? Then we can create civil society groups that are engaging in that unearthing process of us determining the truth of who we really are. And I think that once we really engage in that process, then the health, the mental health, and the physical health will follow.
Dr. Fergus, over to you for the next cycle of questions.
I have two questions. First one is a very simple question, and I think I would direct it to Dr. Soomer. It seems as if when CARICOM articulated the 10-point plan, they took it for granted that the Caribbean territories were independent, because none of those 10 points suggest that there were existing at the time, and still exist, as my brother Kwame has pointed out, over 24 territories that do not even enjoy the first stage of independence. I mean flag independence by that, because we, in having explored the various dimensions to independence, we recognize that even the republics, so-called republics that we have in the Caribbean, do not enjoy full independence yet. So it is in that context I'm saying that it seems as if CARICOM did not take into consideration the question of decolonization as reparations, or a process towards reparations. Could you perhaps attempt to explain why that omission, if it was an omission, on the part of CARICOM, and what are the consequences?
Okay, let me start by saying I was not privy to, I was there when we decided that we were going to seek reparations. I was ambassador at the time, but I wasn't there when the plan was being formulated. But I have been involved in more recent times in reviewing the plan. So I think I bring a very unique perspective, being there at the beginning and being there at the end after 10 years. No plan is perfect. No plan is perfect. And I think that what we try to do in CARICOM, and I'm saying we because I'm an integrationist in my heart. You can't take that away from me. One of the things that we tried to do was to cover a broad spectrum of developmental issues that would leapfrog us to the next level, as contained within the 10-point plan. I think that there are gaps in the 10-point plan. So it is not that it's a perfect plan. For example, as you said, decolonization. Personally, this is me, I don't think there's a term called decolonization. I think that we are continuing with colonization. There's no term called decolonization. If there was a term called decolonization, we would not, as you say, have within the Caribbean very colonial governments. If you look at the Caribbean Sea that we call our own, part of it is owned by France, part of it is owned by the British, part of it is owned by the Dutch, part of it is owned by the Americans. And part of it is owned by these independent countries, the 200 miles border that we have been allotted. And so we operate in a space that keeps us compromised. It keeps us compromised. Now, many people will not agree with me because we are independent countries, even if we have a monarch as a head of our states. We are considered independent countries. We have a voice at the United Nations. We can speak on our own. Our heads of governments can move and talk, as they please. But we have not attacked the fundamental thing that Errol Barrow spoke to. And that was not being in anybody's backyard. He says we have lingered on colonial premises too long when we were looking for independence. It is time for us to become independent. But like everything else, we have to go back to colonialism and understand it. Understand that the dependency that we maintain is part of the extraction process that occurred during enslavement and continued under colonialism. So under colonialism, well, and enslavement also, it was decided by European powers that not a nail would be produced in these Caribbean territories. And so all the industrial development and enslavement is at the root of that industrial development that took place in Europe. Never occurred in the Caribbean. We had to beg for preferential treatment in markets. And I think that kept us even more dependent. We have to beg for independence. And that independence, if you look at the colonial documents that were issued at the time of independence, Secretary of State went up to England and said, if these people come to ask you for independence, don't give them a penny for development. So it has been a kind of structuring that has kept us dependent. And even moving towards republicanism, which I think is a very positive thing, has kept us, dependent on countries that still play out empire in the Caribbean. We have 17 countries that are still colonies in the Caribbean. They don't have a voice in their country, and they do not have a voice in the country of the colonial person. They don't have citizenship in these countries, but they are still continued part of these countries. And they have different configurations of them. But I can tell you that every single one thinks that these Black people in the Caribbean are not capable of taking care of themselves. And so we must oversee. Imagine our former enslavers think that they have a moral right to continue to enslave us in different ways and to continue to keep us oppressed.
Okay, Dr. Soomer, before I ask my second question, I want a conceptual clarification for the sake of our listeners. Yes. We have mentioned the term neo-colonization frequently in previous episodes. So what I want is, now I'm with you with respect to the question of decolonization. It doesn't really exist, but for the sake of our listeners, would you equate this non-decolonization with new colonization or neo-colonialism? In other words, is the term neo-colonialism relevant?
It is a continuation of colonialism in a new form.
Okay, I'll take that for an answer. So let me go on to the second question. I want to sort of pitch this in the context of African decolonization. One of my favorite leaders, and I'm sure that goes for a lot of us.
Before you ask that question, can I say, though, that I think that it is imperative that Caribbean leaders in independent countries realize that they have a responsibility to the non-independent countries to move them towards independence. Mm. We cannot look at them as we cannot continue to look at them as the property of these empires. The British government is trying to rebuild empire in the Caribbean. Look at what it has done. In fact, it has called itself Global Britain. Global Britain. Look at what it has done in the Turks and Caicos. Look at what it's trying to do in the Virgin Islands. and you will see that they are trying to regain control of these countries that have been, especially the Virgin Islands, that have been funding and their own budgets since the 1970s and have not taken a penny in granting aid from England, are now being asked to give special rights to a governor who is not answerable to the people. So you have to look at the issue of democracy also when you look at decolonization in the Caribbean. We cannot continue to survive in a region where there is no democracy. And so that is where the question of the new colonialism takes place. These people have to be accountable for their financial services, as we are. We are put on white lists all the time to make sure that we are punished for not following their rules, yet they break every international rule possible. And so I am saying that if we do not help those countries to decolonize themselves or to become independent, or whatever term you want to use, then our own democracy and our own decolonization process will be compromised.
Right. Thank you very much for that clarification. As I said, I would preamble my question on the Pan-Africanist extraordinary Kwame Nkrumah, who famously said, "Seek first the political kingdom, and all things shall be added." And, the issue for me is, what if you are a minority in that kingdom? There are issues there for us in the Americas where a lot of the diaspora and the indigenous peoples are in a situation where they were internally colonized by the ruling class that are now there. So what does decolonization in the context of reparations mean for them? He also made the famous statement that the independence of Ghana is meaningless until such time that the rest of the continent is free of colonial rule. Now, I want you to address, if briefly, how that question related to Haiti in the historical context, where Haiti was alone for over 100 years as the only independent post-slavery state in the Americas, and likely accounted for not only isolation, but the underdevelopment, the oppression, because the only relationship that she could have with any free state were the free oppressor states that had colonized the region. So what is the meaning for Haiti in the context of Nkrumah's statement in terms of total decolonization of the region, but at a time when Haiti was all alone in the Caribbean? Does that help to explain Haiti's predicament that continues today? So the main question I have would be, what does decolonization mean in the context of reparations for minority peoples? I want to focus on just the minority. For minority peoples in both North and South America. For example, African Americans, even indigenous peoples, the indigenous peoples would have gotten land and in some cases financial compensation. In the case of African Americans, they had been promised 40 acres and a mule, but that obviously, the value of that now will have to be sort of readjusted to suit the value of things and land and everything else in the contemporary context. But in terms of a homeland, how do you deal with political independence within the context of internal colonization? Where you are a minority, not in the case of South Africa, where there was also internal colonization, but where the colonized masses were the majority and would have been at least hopeful of gaining control of the government. In the United States, in other Latin American countries, how do they, in a sense, maintain any kind of hope for reparations within the current construct of the independence of those states without seeking independent homelands for themselves. I don't know if the question is clear enough. Otherwise, I would repeat the main thing. What does decolonization mean in the context?
Issues. Yes.
Yeah, for minorities. So that question is for both Dr. Soomer and Dr. Campbell-Dean. So you can decide who is going first.
Niambi?
And welcome, my brother Shabaka is here with us. So welcome.
Hello, Shabaka.
Dr. Niambi, you are invited to go first.
I think what I would add to that is that I think when we look at the reparations movement in places where there is the situation is a little different than it is in the Caribbean. Well, one of the things I would want to focus on is that they do have a very thriving reparations movement in many places, in many cities within the United States. So I'm thinking of the reparations movement in Illinois, for example, where they are currently actually receiving reparations, right? In Asheville, North Carolina, where they are on the verge of receiving reparations as well. And I think while they do have the challenge of being a minority in a land of a majority, they have a system in which they can focus on the illegality of certain elements that have happened in their society and receive reparations in that way. And so while they might not be seeking reparations on the scale that we are, they have focused on very specific things that have happened. So like in Chicago with the issues around marijuana and how persons in their community have been disproportionately disadvantaged by laws around marijuana. So I think that by finding your power in those small areas, you can build on that, right? And then find your power in larger areas. And even though they are minorities in their communities, as the election is gearing up in the United States, all of those conversations keep coming back to, well, what is the Black vote going to be? What is the Black vote? And how is the Black vote going to swing one way or another? So I think that there are ways that with unity, as in all reparations movements, they can find their power to institute the changes that they need, and in some ways create their own communities within the larger context.
So how would you, for clarity within the context of the question for tonight, reparations, decolonization in the United States, would the search for office, that quest for office, be a substitute for decolonization? How does it work? That political empowerment. We know we can talk about decolonization of the mind, but I think we are more focused on political decolonization this evening. So how is there a substitute for what could be effective decolonization or potential decolonization in the Caribbean as against the United States, where there is a distinctive minority population?
I don't get the emphasis on minority, because if you look at the history of the reparations movement, it was not ever done as a collective when it first started. Individuals asked for reparations and repair to their situation. So you had women going before the court and saying, I worked for this planter for how many years? Or men going before the court and saying, my wife and I worked for you for how many years? And we are owed this money for our labor, our unpaid labor. We are owed a pension. We are owed different things. So minorities have always asked for reparations as individuals. Communities have asked for reparations. The people who were involved in the Wilmington riots, the Tulsa, Oklahoma riots, those who were transported to California. California has a big reparations commission going on right now. And it was these people are minorities because they were transported. 4,000 enslaved people were transported to California. Was not originally a state with enslaved people. So they transported them from the South over to California to work, and they can trace their ancestors. And so they're working on reparations for them. So we see that also. We see it in Latin America, where right now, because of the re-identification of people of African descent, most of these populations realize that 30-something% of their populations are identifying as people of African descent, people of who were whose ancestors were enslaved, and who are asking for reparations. As critical as we are of the Caribbean and the CARICOM Reparations Commission and Committee and 10-point plan, this 10-point plan has started a global conversation that we cannot stop at this time. We cannot stop because we are now at the forefront of putting it out there. And so on Friday, or not on Friday, I'm lost in time. On Tuesday, when I was coming up to the United States, I had to stop for a short while on the airport to do a call with the Latin American people who are asking about reparations and development justice. They want to speak to these issues, and they were asking for how they could move this forward. So we had a conversation on that. We have on the 27th, there's another group from the OAS who have asked me to speak to Latin Americans on the reparations movement and how they can write a declaration for reparations for the Americas. So this thing has mushroomed and ballooned much further than you think, and it's more impactful than you think. With regard to the issue of majority now, because you spoke to minority, let me speak to majority, like Haiti. Haiti was a majority country. Majority of the people were of African descent, were enslaved Africans who fought for their freedom. In colonialism, do you think that such a situation, when colonialism is also intertwined with white capitalism, do you think that Haiti would ever be allowed to survive? No. And so it was the first time you saw a European Union against a black state, because the French, the British, and the Spanish got together to put down Haiti. And in the end, the Americans also joined. And so the Haitians were asked to pay the same way they paid the white planters. The Haitians were asked to pay to France, which they did not stop paying until the 1940s, a certain amount of money. So Haiti has two issues. Haiti has the issue of restitution because they want their money back, give them back their money, and I agree with them. And they also have the issue of reparations for enslavement and colonialism. So it's double that. If we are talking numbers, if you look at the Brattle report, I just did a presentation on the Brattle report and reparations for women of African descent. The Brattle report speaks to more than $120 trillion for the Americas and the Caribbean, with things that can be quantified right now. There's some things that they think are not quantifiable. And one of them, for example, is what Niambi spoke to, the issue of the trauma. How do you measure the trauma that has been caused? I think you can quantify it. I think you can quantify it, and we need a set of psychologists, like people like Haiti and Niambi, and people who are psychiatrists and so on, for us to be able to sit down and look at how you quantify these things. Now, the issue is not that we are going to get the money, the $120 trillion that is owed to us. The issue is that somebody must be held accountable for what has happened to us. The same people who enslaved us are now asking us to be accountable for many things. Otherwise, we get punished on the international stage and shamed on the international stage. Why are we not holding them accountable for what they have done to Africa and people of African descent? We are and Marcus Garvey said it in his 1920 Declaration of the Negro, that there is not a place in this world that the African is not seen as a lesser being. They have removed our humanity, but we don't have to prove we are human. We are human. What we have to now fight for is our rights, and I think that is what reparations is giving us the avenue to do. And so, let me conclude my statement by saying that all of us owe Haiti a debt. Every single person of Caribbean descent, every Latin American person of Caribbean descent owes Haiti a debt. When Simon Bolivar was going to fight for the independence of Venezuela, he went to Haiti and he escaped from the Spanish, and it was Haiti that gave him money, guns, arms, and a ship to go back to Venezuela to fight. And the only condition was that wherever you meet people of African descent, you have to free them. It was part of the Haitian Declaration of Independence that anybody who steps foot in Haiti, any person of African descent, would be a free man, and that anybody who went to fight in Latin America for freedom had to free enslaved people also. And so it has always been part of Haiti's thinking and psyche that people of African descent must be free. And I think that we owe Haiti that debt, because a lot of us have taken that and run if it wasn't for Haiti, that showed that you can dismantle a slavery system, we would have been fighting much longer for our emancipation.
And can I just add to that as well, when we talk about the dismantling, because I think, and this comes from your statement about the psychological decolonization and the political decolonization. And in my mind, the one really cannot occur without the other. Because even when we look at Haiti, that revolution it started as a spiritual revolution, right? Without the spiritual elements, without the psychological understanding, that revolution would not have jumped off and been as successful in the way that it did. And I think that this is also important when we look at the term minority, as is used in the context in the North and in the South, recognizing that whiteness is a construct, right? And that even in the United States, a lot of the people who now consider themselves white weren't always considered white. And so as the numbers of people of minority now become the actual majority in the United States, that psychological construct of, well, what does it mean to be a minority and who is in the majority is going to change as well. And so if we don't clearly understand what our Blackness is and how we perceive it, who that unites us with, then we will lose even more power than we think that we have, or that we think that we have as a quote unquote minority in these different regions and different contexts.
And we are not minorities in many of them. As I said, the census is showing that we are at least 1/3 of the population in most Latin American countries. And in Brazil, we are more than 55% of the population. So we are not a minority there either. But I certainly agree with you that we have to decolonize the language. Mm-hmm. And we have to look at some of the terms that we use more closely.
Absolutely, absolutely. We want to bring our brother Shabaka in. Welcome, our brother Shabaka. You came in the middle of the conversation here on tonight. We want to turn attention to you as you field a couple questions, or perhaps make a few comments. Within 5 minutes, we get to the top of the hour, and we be bringing the Talk City audience to an end. So perhaps you may want to give them some advice in terms of how they can hop over for what I'm sure would be Indaba overtime. But over to you, Brother Shabaka.
Yes,
Okay,
okay.
our producers have said, just a minute, Shabaka, we have just 5 minutes for the rest of the program, so we got to be brief and take our closing comments at the same time. So we go only to the top of the hour. So go ahead, Shabaka. No
Well,
overtime tonight.
with 5 minutes left in the program, it's difficult to decide where to go with the amount of interesting issues that were raised tonight by our guests, our special guests. I want to say a special good night to them. One of the things that sticks out with me perhaps is the question of our own responsibility. I think part of the decolonization issue is our own responsibility, to decolonize ourselves. It forces us to look critically at the way we have been operating in the post-independence period, where we continue to operate, continue to leave all those elements of that were part of the colonial structure here in the Caribbean in place with such potency, from the content of the curricula, the statues that venerate colonial icons, the celebrities of genocide, slavery, internship, and apartheid in all the public places across the region. Even despite the protests from the people, the aspects of our constitution, the savings clauses that we don't adequately address. So there's all kinds of things for us still to do to journey along that road to freedom. And I think that perhaps the reparations movement has to consider how it can also put pressure on our own governments here in the Caribbean to move us forward as a people, even as we continue to engage the former colonial powers to engage in the case of Haiti, restitution and reparations, and the rest of us reparations. So I just wanted to throw that out and perhaps get a comment from our guests.
Well, in commenting, let's make those comments the closing comments for this evening. We are near to the top of the hour. So respond if you may, and closing comment, Dr. Niambi Hall, Campbell-Dean, you go first, and then closing remarks, Dr. Soomer, and yes, Dr. Campbell-Dean.
Well, I would just like to say thank you for having me on this program. I feel like we just started this conversation, and so I would love to be able to continue it at another time. Recognizing that, as Brother Shabaka was stating, that there's so much that we could do to decolonize ourselves. We have to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery, because none but ourselves can free our minds. And so I'd just like to leave you all with those words from the elder, more wise than myself, and say good night and thank you.
Thank you.
Dr.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and also for having me on the program. We have to do the two things simultaneously. We cannot stop the fight against colonialism and the fight for reparations to say we are repairing ourselves. We have to do the two things simultaneously. And so I totally agree with you that it has to be done. But the other thing I want you to realize is that not all of us are on the same page. The fight against the reparations movement in the Caribbean is as great as the fight for reparations in the Caribbean. So if we are not all on the same page, how are we going to bring our citizens together to advocate and to speak to governments about what they should do and what they shouldn't do? Because some people are for it and some people are against it. Some people are indifferent. Why take down the statue? And they don't understand why. And that is part of the healing that we need to undertake. And so I would recommend that part of the remit of your committee must be the discussions around self-healing and internal healing for us to move on and to consolidate what we really need to concentrate on after a while. And that is the development justice that we deserve through reparations. There can be no sustainable development without reparations.
Yes, so thank you very much, Dr. Soomer, Dr. Campbell-Dean, for sharing your thoughts with us on the program this evening, and of course sharing your thoughts with our global listeners. And as usual, in his inimitable way, Brother Kwame will take us out as we say good night to our listeners on 91.1 FM. And to Ruskin Mark, thanks for being with us this evening. Kwame.
Oh, thank you so very much. Again, we would like to thank our Facebook audience and our YouTube audience for tuning in on tonight. It's another edition of Indaba, the place where knowledge grows, the voice of the Emancipation Support Committee, the voice of the people, where we find consensus. We've had two sterling scholars par excellence on tonight dealing with the issue of the decolonization of the Caribbean within a reparatory justice and development context. Of course, we are reminded that reparations has 5 components. They are restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, of course, satisfaction and guarantees of non-repetition. Many have argued that that must include a 6th, and that 6th would be the cessation of hostilities, because you cannot be talking about repairing old wounds if we are being attacked in real time. We have political, economic, spiritual, and other constructs that still continue to harm us in present day. And in the words that we've used in the past, it is an active crime scene taking place not only within the Caribbean context, but within the continental context. Tonight, we are not out of love, certainly not out of faith. Absolutely, I promise you, not out of words. But
just
now,
a brief greeting to our listeners online, Kwame. Just a brief recognition of our listeners.
Oh yes, I would be happy. I would be happy so to do. We want to recognize out of Burkina Faso, Her Royal Highness Princess Aina. We want to recognize of the Trinidad and Tobago our loyal listeners, including Dexter Philip Miller, Clive E. Banks out of Honduras. We have on tonight those who are tuned in from the Bahamas, locked in and listening attentively. Of course, one of them says out of the Bahamas, the colonial master don't want to let us go. And our leaders is just there, page boys and girls, they say, very fiery. That's why we must hold our leaders responsible for situations that they cause. They ain't standing up for us. So one of the things about this Indaba audience is that they are very vocal. We've given them a voice and they have no problem using it. Dr. Clive Banks, again out of Honduras, Sister Irene and et al. We have a loyal listenership and following, and perhaps you would want to share that with your friends and family. Give us a like. Please continue to comment, but do share it by way of your socials to all and sundry, because we need to get this Indaba radio / multimedia program going and growing, and we are going to need our Indaba social media army to take us there. Again, I'm mindful of the fact that we are out of time, but definitely we look forward to seeing you same place, same time, same channel next Wednesday for another scintillating edition of Indaba. And on that occasion, one of our hosts would be a special guest. And we will certainly say no more about that, even as we look forward to that extremely didactic program that is to come. Until then, goodbye for now. Kwaheri and tunanitena, which is Swahili to say goodbye and see you soon.